Hello, and thank you for checking out this video. I'm very pleased today to be here talking about a very important topic about security automation on Azure. Hi, my name is Nathan Swift, and I'm a security cloud solution architect at Microsoft. Over the course of the next series of videos that are going to be recorded, we're going to be talking about security automation. And so, why security automation? Well, while I was building playbooks and workflow automation both for Azure Sentinel and Azure Security Center, I would get questions from colleagues and customers as well as how to start building these automations, how to think about them systematically, and then also how to do that and design them within Logic apps. So over the course of the next series of videos, we're going to be talking about all these wonderful things that are very dear to my heart. As an example, we'll probably take a security automation, maybe something as simple as orchestrating, and send an email to not only the security team when an Azure Security Center alert or an Azure Defender alert fires off, but also anyone that was involved around the Azure resource itself, maybe creating it or modifying it within the last 7 or 14 days. So that we kind of widen the scope and audience that's going to receive that email. So let's go ahead and dive into this. So to begin with, when we're thinking about automating security on Azure, there are some fundamental things to think about. Really, there's kind of three main areas that you can automate security on Azure. The first area that you can think about when you want to automate security on Azure is enriching data. So simple things like getting a geolocation or checking against an IP or URL for reputation or information about it by sending it to VirusTotal or Gray Noise, looking up other fields of data on the entity, and then potentially maybe even an Azure AD account. Is this person part of a sales role who may be traveling quite frequently? The other types of automation that we see out there are responses into the management plane of Azure. And what I mean by that is simply during a security incident, maybe someone wants to isolate a virtual machine, or they want to revoke access to an Azure AD account, or maybe they want to update a firewall with some additional IP addresses to block. The final type of automation that we can think about building is orchestration. So can we create a ticket, send a notification to certain folks involved in the security incident, send a text message out when we're outside of normal office hours to maybe a SOC manager, or maybe email a manager to the that's involved with the employee that was in a security incident. So if you have by chance other ideas that fall outside of these three categories, I'd love to learn a little bit more about it. Feel free to respond and comment below in the video. So to begin with, we always want to start with a very crisp problem statement. And by using a crisp problem statement, we can quickly identify what we're trying to automate, what we're trying to solve for. And then going into that problem statement, we can develop a hypothesis of how we're going to go about doing that. So think about the what and the why of what we're trying to solve, and then how are we going to go about doing that. Now, I've used this template here constructively as I start thinking about security automations that I want to build. And I start with a trigger. Is this going to be triggered from Azure Security Center's recommendations, or an Azure Defender alert, or maybe an Azure Security Center compliance check? Or maybe it's an Azure Sentinel or an Azure Sentinel automation rule that's kicking this off. We then can interpret what some of the data entities or data elements that are involved with the triggering that we're going to want to use as we're automating that security. And then we're going to define security actions and steps that we're going to take in that process. So to get us started, I'm going to go ahead and copy this guy into here. And we're going to start with the problem statement. We want to notify or medium Azure Defender alert, and also the folks that have recently modified or created the Azure resource involved in the alert. So there we have our problem statement that we're going to try to solve through some security automation. That's our what and our why. And so our how, our hypothesis, is going to be a little bit something to this effect. We will form an HTML response email body to send to the security team in a global parameter, and we will also look up the Azure resource ID and compare the Azure activity logs for last 14 days and who may have been creating or editing that Azure resource. So in the how, we're basically explaining that we're going to be sending an email that's going to have an HTML response in the body. So it's not just going to be just simple lines. We're going to have a nice crafted email, like an HTML template. But in particular, we're going to notify the security team using a global parameter. But even more importantly, we're going to take the steps in the automation, in this orchestration that we're building, to look up the Azure resource ID and compare that Azure resource ID in the Azure activity logs for the last 14 days. And then whoever may have been creating or editing that Azure resource will also be notified of the security incident. Very simple kind of logic app to kind of get us started here. But now that we know this, we're going to need to know some things, right? We're going to need to know the Azure resource ID that was involved in the alert. We're going to need to know the security team. And then some of the actions that we're going to take are, we'll start filling out here. So we're going to go ahead, and we know that this is going to be an Azure Defender alert trigger. And we know that we're going to first do a couple things. We're going to look up the Azure activity logs for 14 days. And we're going to filter those logs based on folks who created or updated Azure resource ID. Now in there, we may, when we're looking at look up the Azure activity logs for 14 days against the resource ID. So it's not that we want to take 14 days worth of Azure activity logs. We want to kind of filter this either against our resource group or the resource ID. We'll have to play around with the Azure activity logs and the APIs involved with that. But hopefully we won't have to grab the entire 14 days worth of logs. We'll find out, and we may have to do some additional filtering on those logs. But look up the Azure activity logs for 14 days against the resource, Azure resource ID. There we go. And then we're going to do a couple more things here. And we're going to do something like We'll probably do a for each loop because it's very possible that the returned results on whoever's created or edited this Azure Resource ID may be multiple people. So we're going to do kind of a for each loop, and we may change the color here just a little bit just to designate that that's a for each loop. And go ahead and bring this guy into that for each loop. And so we'll filter on the caller ID and append into a string variable. And so as we're starting to do this, we're starting to think about some different things that are needed in this automation. So for instance, now that we're taking that caller ID and appending it into a string variable, we're going to need to create a variable in order to bring that in. So create variable for email addresses who edited or created Azure Resource. And then finally, once we have that, we're going to send that email off. So we'll go ahead and send an email to security team and folks involved with the Azure resource. Again, involved means really creating the resource within the last 14 days of that security alert, or editing and modifying that resource. And before we even send that off, we will need to do one more thing in between that, and that is form an HTML template body with the Azure Defender alert details. And those details could be what Azure resource name was involved, what the description or the title of the alert was, severity of the alert, a link back to the Azure Defender alert page specific to that alert, and probably a couple other things as well too. So again, we're probably going to want to, as I'm talking about that, update and say that we need the Azure alert details, and we're going to go ahead and want the Azure alert URL. And there we have it. We now have a nice crisp problem statement of what we're trying to solve, our hypothesis and how we're going to solve this in the logic app. We start with the trigger, and then each of the actions or steps we're going to take in that security automation, along with some of the data that we're going to be using along the way. Now, as we continue to update and build this logic app, this is going to change. You'll see here, I'm trying to use language that's a bit more logical and process-oriented rather than specific. In some cases, I am getting specific, but as we start to build that logic app, it will be a lot more specific. So we'll come back to this, probably update it towards the end here. Now, this security automation template can also be found on my GitHub page here under Decks. And if you want to follow along, or if you're trying to think about the process or think about the security automation a little bit further, feel free to download the security automation template from my GitHub, swiftsolves-msft, under the Dex repo, and it's available there to download and use. I hope that it's very useful for you, helps kind of clarify what you're trying to build and use. Ultimately, these security automations that we're working to build here are going to land in probably two areas, right, in GitHub. One is if the automations Azure Sentinel in the playbooks repo, you'll find a number of these automations, all kinds of things kind of falling into those three buckets of whether enriching the data, orchestrating against the data, or responding to the Azure management plane or the plane of the device or the server itself. So you'll find all kinds of interesting what they call playbooks in Azure Sentinel here, and a lot of these playbooks are starting to be updated so that they work with Azure Sentinel's automation rules. So that's really cool to see. The other kind of automations that you can build are for Azure Security Center as well. And within Azure Security Center, they're called workflow automations. And those workflow automations, again, kind of fall into those three buckets. You'll find here you can isolate an Azure virtual machine. You can do things like notify a Azure Security Center recommendation based off a resource tag, specifically when you go multi-cloud and bring in Arc-enabled VMs from AWS and GCP, or Arc-enabled Kubernetes clusters from those cloud services or on-prem. You may want to tag those resources so that they can go ahead and be notified via an email too when there's a security center recommendation in regards to posture management or maybe a vulnerability found. Also, if you want to learn a little bit more about security automations, you can use these two repos, but you can also look within the Azure Security community webinars. And if you do a Control F and look for logic apps, for instance, you'll find that there was one created around April 28th where we were automating security of Azure Security Center and logic apps to learn a little bit more. Or Azure Sentinel on September 30th of last year, unleashing Azure Sentinel automation, Jedi tricks in building logic app playbooks like a boss. Really great stuff. And in fact, there's an upcoming one too, I believe, in November. So let me go ahead and search for playbook here. And there we go. So November 16th, create your own Azure Sentinel solutions. Easy way to deploy packages that can include analytic rules, parsers, playbooks, and workbooks. So that will be a very interesting one that's going to be upcoming on November 16th that you may want to attend around that subject area. The other area too that you can learn a little bit more if you want to go outside of the medium that we're using and the series that we're using here is not just the Azure Security Community webinars, but also the Azure Security Center or Azure Sentinel Tech Community blog articles. These are wonderful articles written by employees at Microsoft and also MVP community members around all kinds of different topics. And in fact, one of my favorite articles that I use constantly when I'm building security automations is one by George Wilburn here, working with logic app parameters while building Azure. And so this is a really great primer on how to use logic app and within logic app how to use some of the functionality there. And it's primarily around the resource ID and being able to split and take certain parts of that resource ID in that logic app and pass them into their own variables. And so George walks through a really great use case around that. And in particular, a really great pattern, which we're going to actually be using in the upcoming series 2 here, where we can skip and split on the Azure Resource ID and pull the name of the resource or pull the subscription ID or the resource group name of that Azure resource that's involved, so we can pass it along and filter in the Azure activity logs. Really great stuff. So definitely check out some of that work there. Finally, I want to just shout out and just thank Gwyneth for some inspiration for me starting this YouTube series under SwiftSolves. Gwyneth's been at Microsoft for several months here, and she's done some amazing work and recently released kind of a 7-day cloud YouTube starter kit. And what that really means, right, is how to think about creating the content and how to deliver that content. And again, big shout out to Gwyneth here. She's written some really great stuff. So if you're watching this and you're thinking, wow, I've got a lot of tribal knowledge I've built up or experienced over the years, and I want to pay it forward and give back to the community, this is a really great way to kind of start thinking about that, what type of equipment, what type of software to get. Another big shout out again to is Stephen Helwig, who's helped me out a little bit through some of the initial setup of the gear and stuff there. So really thankful that I get to work with an amazing company with amazing folks that do some amazing things. All right, well, hopefully this video has been helpful. We've kind of started talking about systematizing and thinking about security automations when writing in Logic apps for Azure Sentinel or Azure Defender. One other area that I didn't really touch upon, but also can be used to automate, is Azure networking services. So Azure Firewall, Azure Web Application Firewall that's attached to a front door or to a application gateway like 11 layer 7 load balancer, network security groups. There's all kinds of other automations you can do in the Azure network layer from a security perspective. Again, we talked a little bit about how when we think about security automation, that there's kind of like 3 buckets that they fall into. You're either enriching the data, you're responding to the security incident by updating the management frame by revoking someone's access into Active Directory or Azure Active Directory, or isolating a VM, or taking a URL that's now been detected as phishing and the security analyst has confirmed it, and pushing that URL to be blocked on Microsoft Defender endpoint devices. The third and final kind of automation that we can think about is the orchestration of that alert. Do we need to create a Jira ticket based off some cloud security posture management and let some developers be aware of how they're deploying infrastructure as code? They need to button that up a little bit so that these alerts and recommendations don't come about again. Do we need to send an alert via text message to someone that's on call because it's out of office hours? So orchestration, responding, and enrichment are kind of the 3 main areas you can think about with security automation. Again, if there's another area outside of those 3 that wouldn't kind of cover that, I would love to hear about that. I'm always constantly curious and I always like to learn more. There are some amazing folks in this space doing some really amazing security automation. So get started, check out some of the links in the notes, and in the next video, we're going to finally jump into the Azure portal and we're going to start building that automation that we were hypothesizing about earlier. Thank you and have a wonderful day.